This is your introductory lecture to energy. We're going to be talking about energy. We're going to be looking at photosynthesis and respiration. We're going to be looking at diet. We're going to be looking at exercise physiology. So this is a big section, but hopefully one that's very relatable to your life. So to begin with energy, what we want is a little bit of a background. We want to talk about both potential energy, and we want to talk about kinetic energy. And I know you've heard these terms before. Potential energy is the stored energy, and the kinetic energy is the energy of motion. And so, you know, in this example, what you have is these soccer players that are converting the potential energy of nutrients, specifically carbs and fats in their blood, into the kinetic energy of motion in order to fly into the air like this and kick the ball. Now, what we're going to talk about on a chemical level is that molecular stability is related to potential energy, and then that's directly related to kinetic energy. So molecules that are unstable have high potential energy. And that's great, because if you have a lot of potential energy, there's a lot of potential there for work to be done. So unstable molecules that we'll be working with are things like ATP. We're going to be working with carbs that have a lot of potential energy in them, as well as fats. So these guys, the potential energy in these are converted into this high potential energy molecule during the process of cellular respiration. Okay, so a couple of things here. I'm going to draw you a diagram. So on our y-axis is potential energy going up, increasing, and then we have increasing with time. So we have two types of reactions. We have uphill reactions that build potential energy, and then we have downhill reactions that use that potential energy and actually convert it into kinetic energy. So we have uphill and we have downhill reactions. And we're going to be dealing with a number of these. The first thing I want to show you with this is with the molecule ATP. So ATP, if you recall, is a nucleotide that never forms a nucleic acid, right? It just exists as a nucleotide, and it has 3 phosphates on it, and if you remember, these are all charged negative. So ATP is an example of an unstable molecule with really high potential energy, and it's one of the reasons that every organism on Earth uses it in order to do work. So this molecule traps a lot of potential energy in it, so I'm going to put it way at the top of our potential energy diagram. So where is the energy in this molecule? It's actually between the phosphate groups, so here and here. And the reason is because the instability of the molecule comes from 3 consecutive negative groups. And if you remember our chemistry talk, opposites attract in chemistry, and so like charges repel one another. So these guys are just barely holding on, right? And they're actually covalently bonded, which is a strong bond, but these bonds are forced. This is a forced bond that occurs during cellular respiration to build this big unstable molecule. So these 3 negative groups are where the potential energy is. Now you can take off a phosphate group, so ATP minus one of those phosphate groups, you know, creates your little inorganic phosphate. It's got its little negative charge on it, and that gives you ADP. And ADP is a diphosphate with only 2 phosphate groups. So this is more stable, and because of that, it has less potential energy. And likewise over here, this is ATP is less stable because there are 3 phosphate groups, and there's more potential energy. So on this diagram, you would have ATP minus a phosphate group gives you ADP with lower potential energy. Now you can actually get down to AMP as well, but we're not going to do that in this class. We're just going to work with ADP. Okay, so when ATP is used, a phosphate is taken off and it's transferred to the molecule that needs it. So oftentimes it's a protein, so this phosphate will actually bind to the protein and that gives it the energy for kinetic to do work for that kinetic energy. And so that's a transfer from potential energy in the ATP molecule to the work of the actual molecule or compound doing the work. And then what's left over is ADP. So you've got ADP floating around. So what happens with that ADP, you know, really hardly anything is wasted in cells. So you've got ADP. And what's going to happen during cellular respiration is a phosphate group is going to be forced on to ADP and you're going to build more ATP. So this reaction is circular, right? So you use it, you build it. You use it, you build it. You use it, you build it. And that happens over and over and over again. And so if we go back to our diagram over here, this is ADP plus a phosphate that gives you ATP. Now this actually has a name. So this one right here, when you add a phosphate, what we call that, I'm going to write down here, is phosphorylation. And I want you to know that term. It's important. So when we burn sugars and fats, what we do, literally what we're doing is we're building ATP molecules, and that process is called phosphorylation. That's ADP plus a phosphate to produce ATP. Okay. So there's a couple other reactions we're going to be doing. I have a little bit of space right here, so let's go here. So if this is our potential energy diagram, I want to show you one more example here. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to be doing is looking at photosynthesis and respiration. And photosynthesis is an uphill reaction. You take CO2, you take water, and you build a carb. And that is what we call coupled with cellular respiration, which is where you take a carb and you break it down into its more stable components, which are CO2 and water. So you can see that these are equal and opposite reactions. The carb has the highest potential energy. These reactants have less potential energy. So photosynthesis is uphill on this side of the hump, and respiration is downhill. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background here. What I also want to do is a little more in-depth on photosynthesis and respiration, and hopefully then we can go into more of the specifics of each of these. Okay, so let's take a look at plants and animals, all right? So here's an animal. That's you. Okay, very rough drawing. And for you to eat, what you do is you intake food, right? Right there. And plants, on the other hand, draw a flower. Okay? Plants, on the other hand, instead of taking in food directly, take in CO2 and also take in sunlight. And really we should be pointing to the leaf here, so let's change that arrow. Okay? So CO2 and sunlight. The other thing that it takes in order to do photosynthesis is actually water. Okay, so CO2, light, and water. All right, so we take in food directly, so those are things like carbs and fats if we're just looking at energy, right? If we're looking at proteins, then of course we take in protein as well. And then what we have is a digestive system that essentially breaks down carbs and fats into their monomers. So monosaccharides, and fatty acids. Okay, over here, what we have is CO2, sunlight, and water. And plants, if we go ahead and kind of expand on one of these, let's look at a cell within a leaf. What plants do is they have chloroplasts, so that they can make their own carbs, essentially, right? So we eat carbs, fats. Plants go ahead and generate their own carbs from CO2, sunlight, and water. They don't need a digestive system to break down these carbs into monomers, because when they make them, they make monomers. So they're already ready for cellular respiration. So there's no need for a digestive system in this case. Now, both of these guys, humans as well as plants, have to be able to take monosaccharides, so here and here, or fatty acids, and turn them into ATP. Carbs and fats in and of themselves are meaningless. Cells can't do anything with those. It has to be in the form of ATP. So what both plants and animals and most eukaryotic cells have is mitochondria. So actually all eukaryotic cells will have this mitochondria. And what the mitochondria is for is it allows cells to take CO2, it allows cells to take, let me rewind that. Okay, so the mitochondria allows cells to take a carbohydrate plus oxygen and produce ATP, and in the process also produce CO2 and water. Okay, and so both plants and animals, and really most eukaryotic cells, there are certain eukaryotic cells like yeast that will go through an anaerobic form of respiration only and not aerobic. So this is aerobic, cellular respiration, aerobic respiration, because you can see that O2 right there. And that's what the mitochondria is used for. That organelle is able to use oxygen to strip a carbohydrate of its hydrogens and produce a lot of ATP. Okay, so big picture here, you know, if we're just looking at plants and animals, animals eat, plants generate carbs from photosynthesis, don't need them to be broken down into monomers because they're generated as monomers. Plants do store carbohydrates as longer chains that they can then access, and enzymes would go ahead and cleave those bonds so that they can have monomers. And then humans, animals, eating food, the digestive system goes ahead and breaks apart those monomers, brings them into the blood and circulates it so that cells can use them, pull it into a cell. Doesn't matter if you're a plant or an animal, the mitochondria goes ahead and uses that carb and oxygen to produce ATP, CO2, and water. Okay, so this is aerobic respiration. And this happens in most eukaryotic cells. Okay, that's your introduction to energy. And next, what we're going to do is photosynthesis and respiration.